Hello, everyone. So great to be meeting you all here this Wednesday. I am here with Saket Soni, the founder and the director of Resilience Force. Welcome, Saket.
Thank you.
You can be with us here.
Thank you.
Hey. My own name is Constanza Frischen. I'm a global leadership group member with Ashoka. And we will be talking today about labor organizing, about resilient workforces, about the future, about climate change, about all these things. And the way it's going to work, everyone, is Saket and I will be chatting for like 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will be having a Q&A with input from all of you. There's a little chat box at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions, and we'll field them on our and get to at least some of them. So with that being said, Saket, great, coming back to you. I'm so glad we can talk. As I said before, you're the founder and director of Resilience Force. You are a labor organizer, and that is organizing laborers to help rebuild our communities after climate disaster strike. And you're also an author. You're an author of a new book, The Great Escape, a true story of forced labor and immigrant dreams in America. It's been gotten wonderful reviews in the New Yorker, in the Guardian. So we'll be posting some of those in the chat. And it is a true story, intimately connected to your work. So I want to start with that book and the story in there, because it gives clues why you're doing what you're doing, basically. So I wanted to start by asking you about this phone call, the mysterious phone call that you got one night that you describe in the book that sort of set you off on that journey. What was this phone call about?
Absolutely. And hi, everyone. Great to be here with all of you. So the book actually starts with a mysterious midnight phone call that I got in 2007. I was a labor organizer in post-Katrina New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina made landfall in August 2005, and it turned the Gulf Coast of the United States into the world's largest construction site. Homes and hospitals, hotels, streets, schools, everything needed to be repaired. This was a recovery of post-war proportions. And I was right in the middle of it. I was running a small, nascent nonprofit organization to protect the workers who were doing the rebuilding. These workers were mostly immigrant workers. They had come from all over the United States and beyond. And they were rebuilding not just New Orleans, but the entire Gulf Coast area. My job was to protect them as they did it, as I could. So that's when I got this mysterious midnight phone call from a newly arrived Indian man. Now, I would get phone calls from US-born workers, Black and white, and many, many immigrant workers, all of whom were Latinos. But I thought to myself, what on earth is an Indian laborer doing? Just arrived all the way from India in the middle of the devastation of the post-Katrina Gulf Coast. And
what was he doing there?
Well, I went on a hunt and found him in a labor camp in Mississippi. It turned out that he was one of 500 Indian laborers, trafficked from India to rebuild oil rigs that were crippled from the storm. Held in a labor camp, these men were working round-the-clock shifts, 24-hour shifts, behind barbed wire fences, living 24 to a room in a labor camp built in company property. They were promised an American dream. They came here because the company promised them green cards, but instead they found themselves on temporary visa. They had sold ancestral land and taken highest interest loans to pay for the promise of these green cards. But it turned out all the promises were false. And so in the book, I tell the story of how that phone call led to the engineering of a great escape. how I don't want to give anything away, but the way that I partnered with the men to set up clandestine meetings, without spoilers, the Great Escape involved lots of wild turkey whiskey and bribes in the form of food and drink and flavored cigars to security guards who were guarding the labor camp that the men were trapped in. And we created an elaborate pretext, a fictitious Indian wedding as the pretext to get the men out and on the road to justice.
Yeah. And as if I don't want to provide any spoilers either, but then the book goes on to detail over 4 years the whereabouts of, the workers, yourself, this nascent movement. And perhaps, from that fundamentally would change your life. What was interesting that in those workers and in your work and the aftermath of the Hurricane Katrina, you also discovered something else, right? You discovered that the first members of a rising new workforce that you called the resilience workforce that moves in when climate disaster strikes. Now, tell us a little bit more about who is the resilience worker and what is so special about them.
Absolutely, yeah. What I didn't know then when I met with these Indian workers and when I was, connecting with many other workers who were rebuilding the Gulf Coast, what I didn't know then was that they were among the first of a rising new workforce that we'd never before seen in the country. As climate change made disasters more frequent and more destructive in the decade that followed Hurricane Katrina, the very workers who were rebuilding were joined by others, and they would go from city to city rebuilding after hurricanes, floods, and fires. Hurricane Katrina was supposed to have been a once in a 100-year event. Since Hurricane Katrina, since 2005, we've had over $200 billion disasters, 200 disasters or more that have caused over $1 billion of damage, which means everywhere disasters grow, an enormous workforce is needed. That's the workforce that we now call the resilience workforce. These are the white blood cells of our country and our economy after climate disasters. They're the ones who make recovery possible after disasters. And as increasingly more and more of us face hurricanes, fires, and floods, whether we live in the South or the Midwest or out in the Western United States, everywhere disasters go, these workers follow. And when workers go, I and my team at Resilience Force follow these workers to protect them and to build out the workforce that's needed.
Thank you, Saket. And what is so interesting about this, you're saying, look, this is a growing economy, right? This is a growing market segment because with more disasters, the demand for this workforce will just grow. On the other hand, there is sort of, let's say, a top-down industry out there, that is ready to help, or that is supposedly ready to help, like FEMA moves in and, helps or does the official rebuilding and so on. So where do your workers come in here? And I'm channeling our mutual friend Sarah Horowitz here in sort of saying, there is an element in there of, workers, human beings self-organizing, coming together and mutual support structures, rebuilding their communities from the ground up. So tell us a little bit more about what you're saying here about this niche and how it, its special position in the market.
Yeah, well, I spend a lot of time in disaster zones. And so for a minute here, just to answer the question, I'll take you to a disaster zone where the cameras don't go. So just imagine that you're in a major American city, right? The wildfires have died. Firefighters have done their job. Or in the Southeast, the rain has stopped. and the floodwaters have receded, right? Well, what happens next is that everybody's under an enormous amount of pressure. Homeowners need to come home. Parents need to put their kids back in schools, but the schools can't reopen. Mayors need to save their tax bases, which means they need to get the large businesses and small businesses reopened. They need the residents who were displaced, who are also the local workforce, to come back. That's the only way, for example, the hospital can reopen, which is perhaps the biggest employer, in that area. And so everybody's under enormous pressure. There's money coming in through FEMA and the insurance companies. Dollars are coming in to pay for repairs, but everybody's waiting for the workers. So where are the workers? The workers are the people that we represent, that I represent. They're driving in the middle of the night as soon as the roads reopen. And right now, they're parked at a Home Depot parking lot. They're living in their cars. They're sleeping in the streets. There's no infrastructure for them. And although, billions of dollars are flowing into the recovery, the workers doing the work are earning relatively little because they're at the bottom of subcontracting chains, working as independent contractors. And yet they're proud to be there, like teachers or nurses. Over the last 15 years, these workers have developed a deep sense of vocation. They know everyone's depending on them, right? And they've become this workforce in the middle of this that is going to power the recovery. So every morning they get up at 5 or 6 in the morning, and they're on roofs laying tarp on roofs, or they're going deep into the bellies of huge buildings, schools, hospitals, hotels, to get the education system, the health system, or the tourism economy back up. That's how the rebuilding is happening. And while the cameras are there for, the first few days, this recovery takes months and sometimes years. This is a recovery workforce that is going to be needed for a sustained period of time to get people back in their homes, to get the schools reopened, and to get the economy up and running. Those are the workers at the center of the recovery. And what we're trying to do is get all of the stakeholders together, the workers themselves, the residents, the mayors, the private disaster restoration companies, the private equity owners that own those companies and their institutional investors. All of them have a big stake in the recovery working, and therefore all of them have a stake in the workers being able to complete their work and then move on to rebuild after the next disaster.
And as you described, you can already see like these workers are vulnerable to exploitation. Obviously, you said at the bottom of a chain of subcontractors, self-employed, transient, having to move from place to place. And so how do you shape out of this, not even homogeneous workforce? You were saying there are nurses there. There are, those who repair drywalls. There are those who tear the roof. So how do you form out of these sort of, non-homogeneous groups of people? How do you foster this movement? Is question A, and then B, how does that help change, let's say, the table in favor of these workers? But let's first start with how do you build them into a movement?
Well, this workforce on the front lines of disaster restoration, disaster rebuilding, is an incredibly skilled workforce, and although the workforce exists right now, and although the people inside it are incredibly skilled, there aren't enough of them. We need many, many more. So we're doing two things. One is we're protecting the workers who exist. We're raising, or really building, a new floor under their feet, building career ladders for them so that they can get trained and go up the ladder in terms of skill and salary. But we also need to build the scaled, large workforce that disaster restoration will require, not just after disasters, but climate adaptation, preparing and repairing, preparing before the disaster so that homes, schools, cities are resilient, can face disaster better, stronger, and repairing after the disaster. These are among our nation's most imperative needs, and we need a much bigger workforce than the one we have now. So we're protecting the workers we exist, but we're also building the workforce of the future by recruiting and training and deploying these workers so that schools and cities and companies that need these workers working have them. There's another important thing that these workers do. They build physical infrastructure. They build properties. They build the cities that they come into, but they also build important bonds of friendship with the residents of those cities, and we train them to do that as well. Wherever they go, these workers are building a new kind of American social cohesion that never existed before.
Yeah, you described in one of was it one of our conversations, or one of what I read, how a family would put a sign out, no strangers are not welcome here, ended up welcoming an immigrant worker who helped them rebuild their home. So
yeah, that's right.
Is that working together
exactly right.
in these situations fosters empathy in new ways?
Fosters empathy and compassion, and it's just what the doctor ordered for our country. As we heal from many, many rounds of injury and assault on American social cohesion, on our ability to be neighbors to each other. This was a family that put up a sign after their roof had been blown away and the lights were out. The grid had fallen apart. A family that lived in an unincorporated town and felt they had only themselves, left for protection. They put up a sign in Florida that said, "Strangers will be shot." Well, strangers showed up to their house by the dozens on a Sunday morning instead of going to church, and offered to rebuild for them. This was a group of immigrants, an immigrant resilience workforce that showed up and said, "We'll do it for free." The family took their help. We rebuilt their house. And afterwards, we had a meal together. And that's the way we can rebuild bonds, not just buildings, but bonds after American disasters. That's the kind of thing this workforce is uniquely poised to do. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. One important thread in the work of resilience workforce is also you call it the reappraisal of the workforce. And I think that has two sides, right? One is the reappraisal in terms of the appreciation that we give these workers, but then there's also let's say, the hard side of appreciation, which is higher wages. Can you speak a bit to both?
Yeah, we're used to homes going through a reappraisal of value, right? What Resilience Force is trying to engineer is that the workers at the heart of recovery after disasters go through a reappraisal of their value. When you drive by a Home Depot and you see these workers in a hurricane-torn town, a lot of times what people see is unskilled, unemployed workers just looking for a day job, right? That's what most people see. Well, in fact, those workers have been rebuilding after hurricanes for 15 years. They are incredibly skilled, and we want you to see them for what they are. So what will that take? Well, firstly, it takes a lot of gratitude, and that we've seen in enormous amounts. When a crew of workers comes into a town and rebuilds those homes and churches, there is an outpouring of appreciation and gratitude. Just like after the pandemic, there was appreciation for the nurses and doctors, who were at the center of our healing. Well, that's great, and it needs to translate into better standards and better wages. We want to reposition the workers in this economy, and it's an economy with a lot of money flowing in it. Yeah. So, that's why we work with companies, there are large-scale disaster restoration companies that are embracing the idea that if they're going to be in business, they need a workforce. That's why we work with mayors who understand, whatever party they're in, whatever side of the American political spectrum, they know that the key to keeping their tax bases is to rebuild homes and schools fast. So we work with a lot of people to get this workforce protected, paid better. And part of the way we do it is by building out an entire career ladder so that workers who start as laborers can go up the chain and become certified technicians in the restoration industry. This is
so in a way, that is a new profession, right?
That's right, a new profession. Yeah, creating a new highly skilled profession. I mean, I think in the future, these workers will be a lot like auto workers of a different era, people who are the spine of an American middle class, and people who, as the economy changed, came to be understood as playing a really critical role, just the way auto workers were once not understood and then suddenly were.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying somehow key is that you're giving this, disparate and desperate work group a name, and you make them recognizable and you make it into a certified profession. And so that helps you both on the appreciation side and then also on the labor protection standards and wage side. So I think that's really extremely clever. Yeah. I'm starting to see questions from the audience flow in, and I want to pick the first one here. What is the connection between climate refugees and the resilient workforce? One of our listeners is asking.
Well, when we hear the word refugees, what's often conjured up is, people coming from other countries, right? The war in Ukraine produces refugees, or the crisis in Afghanistan, or the politics in Central America. These are the kinds of things we imagine produces refugees. But climate refugees are already here, including the US-born. In city after city across America, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, and other climate events drive people out of their homes. And sometimes people stay out of their homes for months, sometimes for years. They stay on vouchers in hotels, on taxpayers' dollars. They stay, with relatives in a different state. They hope they can make it home, but often never can. And so the connection is that it's the resilience workforce that lets these people come home. It's this workforce that repairs cities, schools, homes, that lets people come home. Now, inside of this workforce, there are actually a lot of people who are climate refugees themselves. We have a lot of people among our workers who are from Honduras and El Salvador and other parts of the world where a typhoon or a cyclone or some other event drove them out, not only out of their home, but out of their entire economy. A drought in Honduras produced an enormous number of climate refugees because the shrimp economy collapsed. A lot of those refugees wound up in the United States and were among the first people to sign up when New Orleans was destroyed after Hurricane Katrina. So there's so much connection. It's very rich. And I think of this workforce as, hopefully big enough one day that we can prevent a refugee crisis.
Interesting. First of all, this also touches on a question somebody else in the audience had. Are the workers bringing the expertise they've gained in their home countries to the U.S. context and vice versa? So elaborate a little bit on what you were just saying, that this will prevent a refugee crisis.
Well, many are. Many workers are prepared for hurricanes because of, having gone through it. Not just in home countries outside of the U.S., but, people who live in Houston and New Orleans and parts of Florida over 15 years have faced successive storms and floods. And all of this prepares people not just to fix up their homes, but to enter the workforce.
Yeah.
And I think, in the future, as more and more storms and floods are predicted, as the warming of the earth causes more and more extreme weather events, we need to make sure that people can stay in their homes, or if they're forced to leave their homes, that they can come back. The way the rules of recovery are written right now, that's not the pattern. The pattern is most people leave for many years or have to leave altogether. We need a workforce big enough and skilled enough that we can change that.
Yeah, there's a very interesting question that is related to what you were saying. I'll read it out to you. When you bring the narrative of climate disaster as an opportunity for growth and empathy, whose narrative are you fighting against? Who is less interested in your ideas growing?
Well, I think that the interesting thing about our work and climate disasters more generally is it provides an incredible opening to break old narratives and replace them with new narratives, but it's not inevitable. So, for example, we follow workers into parts of the United States where the voting population is against big government and against government spending. But after a hurricane, those are the very people who need government spending. They need FEMA to come and help. That's an example of an old narrative that was very sturdy the day before the hurricane.
Yeah.
But that really needs to be replaced by a new one. And we've found constituents among the residents, who ask for that. Another example is narratives about immigration. The sign that said strangers will be shot is part of a fear-based sense in this country that we don't want outsiders, right? And that fear has been used to demagogue immigrants during election cycles. Well, right after a hurricane, immigrants come in to rebuild, and that can turn into an opportunity, an opening to build a new narrative about immigration. But these narratives don't just arrive on their own. It takes all of us. It takes conversation and organizing, to replace an old narrative by a new one. The biggest narrative, I think, out there that needs renewal, that needs refurbishing, is a narrative about we're all on our own. Each of us is on our own. That somehow after disasters, those of us who can self-fund our recovery will, and those of us who can't afford it will just need to move away somewhere else. I think we're all in this together is a much better narrative, a narrative about mutuality. And that's where, just to invoke Sarah's work again, Sarah Horowitz's work, it really is extraordinary to see how after disasters, there is just an extraordinary web of mutuality. And the hope is that web turns into institutions that can change the pattern.
Yeah, yeah. So what does that mean? We are getting to the end of our time, Saket. I'm just saying it's already almost half. So I'm asking you the last question to wrap up. What does that mean for what do you think your work means as a blueprint for our future? Is there a blueprint in there that we can take and adapt to other areas of work?
Absolutely. Look, if you have a home, or live in a home in America, you're impacted by the possibility of climate disaster, and you need to prepare for a future that involves extreme weather, right? This is a uniting issue. And so you need a workforce that's strong. But there's a deeper blueprint out there just generally about how we relate to large-scale disaster in this country. Disaster recovery in America has become among the single greatest, disaster recovery in America has become one of the greatest hidden drivers of inequality. The way we do recovery produces wealth for the already wealthy and takes wealth away from the poor. We need a new blueprint that involves workers getting good jobs, supporting families, and building long-term careers out of the work of rebuilding their own homes and their own lives. That's the blueprint I hope we'll write together.
Thank you so much, Saket, for these powerful words at the end. Everyone, go and check out Saket's book. It should be in the chat, and you can follow him along on social media also. There's the book. You can follow him along on social media. So glad you're part of the Ashoka Fellowship. Thank you so much. And
Thank
everyone,
you.
we'll be live again next Wednesday. Come and join us for another Welcome Change. More information is in the chat. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you. Thanks, Saket. Thanks so much. We'll be in
Thanks so
touch.
much. All right. Talk soon. Bye.
Okay.